Hi, Rod. Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Thank you very much for having me on again.
A continuation this week from what we talked about last week. The exaggerated effect of communism kicked us off, and it was nice to have a sort of a standalone discussion on what is perceived to be one of the most dominant ideologies, certainly in the last couple of centuries. And this week, we're moving on to two other things that have been utilized, certainly in the West, in order to create fear and control. And they're the exaggerated effects of terrorism and of weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. So over to you.
Thanks very much for that introduction. So yes, for the last approximately 20 years, there have been two exaggerated threats that America and Britain and a number of other countries have used to help justify their policies. So the whistleblower Snowden, who is an intelligence analyst for the NSA, has pointed out that intelligence analysts describe terrorism as what they label a cover for action. That is, it is a justification to enable governments to carry out activities, often criminal activities, overseas that they would not usually be able to gain public support for without this exaggerated threat. And various people have suggested that terrorism is the best excuse ever created for unlawful government action. And so following the terrorist attacks of 2001, America declared the global war on terror, which basically has no definable end. And the whole world is potentially the battlefield. So to describe what's really going on, I'm going to go back about 40 years. So throughout history, governments have found it useful to have what are called proxy armies. This is groups of other people to fight their wars. And so in 1979, the CIA, MI6, the Pakistani intelligence services, and Saudi financiers got together to start creating terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. The whole point was to destabilize Afghanistan, basically to suck Russia in to an unwinnable war, what was labeled Russia's Vietnam. And as well as training them to be terrorists, they were also indoctrinated in extremist forms of Islam. And these people fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan for approximately 10 years when the Soviet Union collapsed. And this fighting in Afghanistan may well have contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So those people who were trained then emerged from Afghanistan, and they got involved in fighting in other wars. So over time, they fought in Yugoslavia and more recently in Libya and Syria. They trained other groups of people in extremist Islam and in terrorism. They merged with other groups, and over time they formed Al-Qaeda, and then they formed the basis of what is now labeled as ISIS. And these people have fought in lots and lots of places. And also their activities have repercussions back home. So for example, some of these people were involved with the World Trade Center bombing in 1993. So the idea that the British government and the US government actively train, arm, finance, and protect terrorists is something that has been fairly well documented by academics and other researchers, but is almost never discussed by the mainstream press. So there was a spell in Britain where we had a few people who appeared in the mainstream press quite a lot who were extremist or radical preachers. So some older people might remember names like Abu Hamza and Omar Bakri. And these people had come from these training camps previously. And then in London, they were radicalizing other people. They were basically recruiting people to become terrorists to fight overseas. And the British government operated what's been labeled as a covenant of security. So the British government tolerated these radical preachers in London, provided that London was not a target, because these people and their recruits were useful to the British government for fighting wars overseas. Now, after Britain and America attacked Iraq, the covenant of security came to an end. And so what we've seen more recently is what some people call blowback, where groups of people that we've trained or that we've used to fight our wars actually then turn against us. And so, for example, in the 2017 Manchester bombing, the main person involved there was a product of MI5 assistance to fight in Libya. And similarly, the people involved in the Orlando nightclub attack in 2016 claimed that they were responding to US activities in Iraq and Syria. So this blowback is a kind of fighting back against what's going on in foreign policy. Now, various governments at different times have complained about Britain and America's role in supporting terrorists. And in fact, in 2001, even the American FBI complained that they were unable to investigate people that they believed were terrorists in the United States who were learning to fly airplanes on simulators, because other intelligence agencies would get involved and warn them off because those people were useful to America overseas. And then in, let's say, 1997, there was a massacre in Luxor. The Egyptian government complained that it couldn't investigate because of British protection for the terrorists. Similarly, in 2001, Macedonia complained that America was providing protection for terrorists. So this has sort of widespread long-term ramifications. And then there's a sort of final part to this, which is how America, or Florida particularly, is sort of the safe haven of choice for terrorists that have been supported by the United States government. So most famously, there were some terrorists who blew up a Cuban airliner in 1976, killing 73 people, and they were welcomed by the United States into Florida as a safe haven. So that's the sort of last phase of Britain and America training, funding, and protecting terrorists. Okay, so if we look at the sort of threat idea of terrorism, various people have analyzed the likelihood that someone in Britain or America is a victim of a terrorist attack in Britain or America. So this is not overseas, this is in Britain or America. And they did various calculations showing that actually you're more likely to drown in the bathtub than actually to die in a terrorist attack. And that's even including the 2001 attacks in New York. And in 2005, the United States FBI admitted there were no Al-Qaeda sleeper cells in the United States. And even as late as 2009, the CIA were admitting that there were actually less than 100 Al-Qaeda personnel in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, more recently, since 2011, Britain and America have completely destabilized many countries in the Middle East, particularly Libya. And since then, there has been a massive increase in the number of terrorists in those countries. That still hasn't changed the likelihood that we'll be attacked. It's still highly unlikely that major terrorist attacks will happen in Britain or America. So it's a huge, exaggerated threat to justify British and American foreign policy. So one other thing that's not talked about very much by the media is state-sponsored terrorism. So if we just think of terrorism, we define it in its simplest way as using violence and fear to achieve political goals, then in fact, modern warfare is terrorism. As far as somebody being targeted is concerned, there's really not that much difference between a stealth bomber and a suicide bomber. They're both murdering people for political reasons. Now, governments claim that they don't do terrorism because they don't deliberately target civilians, whereas non-state terrorists do deliberately target civilians. But in fact, this is just very clever propaganda. The British and American governments know full well that when they do a war overseas, they're basically destroying whole countries. And they know that their actions will inevitably lead to the large-scale slaughter of innocent people. So the idea that they're not deliberately targeting them is a sort of irrelevance, really. And then there's another thing to be aware of, which is that there's been quite a lot of research on suicide bombers overseas. And very consistently, the finding is that they are targeting foreign occupiers, and that can be Britain or America having armies in other countries. Historically, it could have been Britain or France occupying countries, say like Algeria. France occupied Algeria, and there were lots of terrorist attacks against the foreign occupiers. And often when the occupiers leave, the terrorist attacks and the suicide attacks particularly tend to decrease significantly. So that's the sort of foreign policy side of things. But there's also a second aspect to using terrorism as an exaggerated threat, and that is so that governments can create oppressive laws at home. And so if you look at Britain and America, we now have in both countries secret surveillance. In America, you can be arrested without trial. You can have indefinite detention. We have secret courts where even the person themselves doesn't know the evidence against them, and their lawyers are not allowed to tell them the evidence against them. And they have to have special lawyers to hear certain evidence that's considered to have national security implications. But we also have legalized state torture and kidnapping in America, with a global network of kidnapping and torture sites, black sites as they call them, which is torture in other countries. We have Guantanamo Bay, and we'll probably talk more about torture in a future week. So Amnesty International made a statement in 2017, and I'll try and read it out sort of reasonably word for word. They were saying that the governments of Britain and America have rushed through a raft of disproportionate and discriminatory laws, eroded the rule of law, enhanced executive powers, peeled away judicial controls, restricted freedom of expression, and exposed everyone to unchecked government surveillance, dismantling hard-won human rights protections. EU governments are using counter-terrorism measures to consolidate draconian powers and strip away human rights under the guise of defending them. We are in danger of creating societies in which liberty becomes the exception and fear the rule. And I think that's a very good description of what's been happening very gradually over the last 20 years. And in fact, in the last couple of years, in relation to coronavirus, we're seeing some states, you can see it very clearly in Australia, introducing some quite draconian rules. And it's very hard to know where that is going to end. So if we come back to terrorism, in fact, there are a number of straightforward solutions to dealing with terrorism. So the first thing is for us to stop invading other countries and committing state terrorist acts ourselves. And one of the things that we need to do is to stop drone assassinations, in that it's been documented fairly well that the drone assassinations often kill a large number of innocent people, and that tends to not only recruit more people to become terrorists, but it actually also leads to much more widespread support for terrorists in those countries, because they don't like innocent people just being murdered by Britain and America. Another thing we have to do is to stop supporting repressive governments that themselves commit state terrorist acts. We have to stop training, funding, arming, and harboring terrorists. We have to start dealing with terrorists like ordinary criminals, and we have to attend to the grievances of people everywhere. And although each one of these sounds simple, it would be an absolute transformation in British and American policy to actually bring that about. But in fact, the solution to terrorism lies with our governments primarily stopping doing the criminal things that they've been doing for many years. Okay, so that's the exaggerated threat of terrorism. Then there's a second exaggerated threat that I'm going to talk about tonight, which has been used a lot in the last 20 years, and that is the exaggerated threat of weapons of mass destruction. So most people will be aware that in 2003, to help to justify the attack on Iraq, we were told that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction that could be used to attack Britain within 45 minutes. And there were big headlines saying this. We've also been warned that Iran and North Korea are developing nuclear weapons, and clearly that must be a threat. And in fact, North Korea now has nuclear weapons. And also in relation to Syria, we were told that the Syrian government had used chemical weapons, and that was a red line that could not be crossed, and therefore we have to intervene and go and save the people of Syria. Now, all of this was a huge distortion of what's really going on. So if we start by discussing nuclear weapons, so the only country ever to have actually used nuclear weapons is the United States, which dropped 2 bombs in World War II. And America since then has developed an enormous arsenal of nuclear weapons, as has Russia. The next 3 countries that have significant stocks of nuclear weapons, but not anything like the scale of America and Russia, would be Britain, France, and China. And then there's 4 other countries that have developed them in small numbers. So that's India and Pakistan, and also Israel, and most recently North Korea. So in total, there's about 13,000 warheads, mostly US and Russian. And unfortunately, that's enough to destroy the world many times over if anybody decides to start launching these in anger. And many of these warheads are orders of magnitude more powerful than the ones that were dropped by America in 1945, which completely destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So any one of these, the biggest warheads, could kill millions of people if targeted at a major city. So it's important to understand the propaganda that goes along with discussions about nuclear weapons. There's a huge set of double standards. So in 1970, there was a discussion about what's called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So this is meant to be an agreement about how to get rid of nuclear weapons. And it has 2 important parts. And one part is that those countries that already have nuclear weapons will actively work to completely eliminate their stockpiles. And then the other part of it is that countries that don't yet have nuclear weapons won't try to acquire them. Now, anytime you watch a media discussion about this, the focus is entirely on the second part. It's about saying, hey, North Korea doesn't have the right to develop nuclear weapons, and Iran doesn't have the right to develop nuclear weapons. What are we going to do to stop that happening? Right? Nobody in the mainstream press actually says, well, hang on a minute. Those countries would never agree to the second part of the treaty if they realized that the countries that already have them were not actually going to try and get rid of what they have. So it's important to recognize that the real problem with nuclear weapons lies with those countries that have them and will not get rid of them. So at the moment, in fact, the countries that already have them, instead of trying to get rid of them, in fact, are doing the opposite. They're trying to develop a new generation of them. And they usually label these as bunker busters. And they say, hey, these are just smaller nuclear weapons. But in fact, they would be similar in size to the ones that were used at the end of World War II. So they would still kill huge numbers of people. But the other thing to bear in mind about those other countries that are often labeled in the media as enemies who are trying to develop them is that a nuclear weapon is the only deterrent that those countries have against invasion and destruction by the United States. So people have seen that Iraq was labeled in the axis of evil and was then destroyed. So countries like Iran and North Korea are in danger of being destroyed by North America if they don't have a deterrent. So many experts who analyze these things suggest that Iran and North Korea would be mad not to develop nuclear weapons and a nuclear deterrent. Now, occasionally you'll see commentators in the West saying, well, we need to be terrified of these countries because they might attack us. But in fact, it seems highly unlikely that these countries would ever attack anybody else as a sort of what's called a first strike, so to initiate the attack, because that would immediately lead to the complete annihilation of their country by other nuclear weapon states. And there are no leaders who want national suicide, basically. So they're not going to attack us. They are developing nuclear weapons solely as a deterrent to protect themselves. Another thing that's worth bearing in mind about with nuclear weapons is that we've actually come much closer to using them on a number of occasions than people realize. Most famously, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, in fact, the order was given aboard a Russian submarine for a nuclear torpedo to be launched. For the torpedo to be fired, three officers, the three most senior officers on board the submarine, all had to agree. And fortunately for everybody, one of the three officers refused to fire the missile. And so nuclear weapons were not used, but we came incredibly close to using them. And that would be an incredibly dangerous situation. So many experts are in favor of the complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Okay, if we then look at chemical and biological weapons, which are the other two categories of weapons often listed as weapons of mass destruction. Firstly, it's important to understand that basic types of chemical and biological warfare goes back centuries. So poisoning wells with dead animals has been carried out for thousands of years. So that's a form of biological warfare. The use of arsenic smoke was recorded in 400 BC. So that would be a form of chemical warfare. And in fact, Britain and America do a similar thing in the present day when we destroy the sanitation systems of countries that we're attacking. When then disease breaks out and the vulnerable tend to be the ones who are most likely to die because of the diseases that break out when the sanitation systems are not working. So US and Britain research both types of weapons in various research labs. And they claim this is purely for defensive purposes, but they never allow inspectors to go in and inspect what's actually taking place. So it seems highly likely they are also researching these weapons for offensive purposes as well. But until we get a whistleblower from inside one of these laboratories telling us that, we can't know that for sure. But the history of British and American research is fairly criminal. So it seems there's a high likelihood that they would be researching these weapons for offensive purposes. And that would be consistent with American and British history of using some of these weapons. So a long time ago, Winston Churchill was perfectly comfortable with using poison gas to poison people in British colonies. And the United States has used a huge range of chemical weapons, particularly in Vietnam. So it used napalm, which is a gel that burns. It used a defoliant called Agent Orange. It's used poison gas to kill livestock and people, rice-killing herbicides. And one of the molecules that were used in some of these poisons was known as dioxin, which is believed to have contributed to huge numbers of birth defects right up until the present day. And one of the things that's very interesting is that in 1984, American soldiers who'd fought in Vietnam were given compensation because of the harms caused by some of these poisons. But of course, no compensation has ever been offered to the people of Vietnam. And if you come right up to the present day, America is still using white phosphorus, which is a chemical that burns intensely and is very difficult to put out. And Britain and America have both used depleted uranium, which a number of experts believe has contributed to birth defects in Iraq. So that's a sort of brief summary of the three main types of weapons that are labeled as weapons of mass destruction. But if you actually come back and look at what goes on when Britain and America are attacking other countries, it becomes clear that regular bullets and bombs are the real weapons of mass destruction in the world. So bombs are being used to destroy whole cities in those countries that America has attacked. And small arms cause the greatest suffering worldwide. And if you look at the damage that a bomb or a bullet can do to a human body, you can get limbs hacked off, brain damage, paralysis, all types of different sorts of mutilation. You know, these are grotesque weapons. the idea that anything that's labeled weapons of mass destruction is particularly worse in terms of the harms it does to individuals is complete nonsense. And in fact, various experts have written over the years saying that actually killing people with cyanide would cause much less suffering than many of the weapons that we currently use. So it makes no sense to accept carnage from bullets and bombs as perfectly acceptable, but to reject chemical weapons as particularly worse. There's no kind of logic to it. It's clearly a propaganda technique. And in fact, what you realize is that even the term weapons of mass destruction was not used very much before approximately 2003. It had been used back in the 1930s and 1940s to describe very large conventional bombs, and then it had gone out of use. And you realize it's a propaganda term to mix up in people's minds a nuclear bomb, which can instantly destroy a city and kill millions of people, with chemical and biological weapons, which in practice tend not to do anything like so much harm. So biological weapons are actually very difficult to use, and in general have not been used as weapons very much. And chemical weapons, on the whole, have not had effects in terms of their scale, much more serious than conventional weapons. So if we sort of look at that in relation to the possible uses of supposed weapons of mass destruction in terrorism. So back in 2001, anthrax was used in America and killed 5 people, but that's hardly a weapon of mass destruction. So in fact, biological weapons are incredibly difficult to use and to control. And then if you look at the use of chemical weapons, sarin gas was used on the Tokyo Underground in 1995 and killed 12 people and injured quite a few more. But again, that would be no more serious than the damage done by a bomb on the underground. So in fact, it's important to recognize that as far as terrorism is concerned, weapons of mass destruction don't really play any part. So that's a nice kind of overview of how terrorism and weapons of mass destruction have been hugely exaggerated in Britain and America to help enable the British and American governments to commit really quite monstrous crimes overseas. Over to you, Jason.
Fabulous, Rod. Yeah, thank you so much. If we can go back to terrorism for a moment, sort of a couple of key points that sort of sprung to mind as I was listening, because obviously I've read the articles and I've taken on board a lot of the content and I've chewed it over in my mind before today. But it does come across, certainly in terms of the incarceration of people without giving them the actual charge sheet of what it is they're supposed to be incarcerated for. It's very Kafkaesque, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, so this is something that, because the mainstream media don't really talk about these issues at all, and because the laws tend to be introduced kind of one at a time, and there'll be a law about allowing undercover people to commit crimes, and so that's been introduced recently, and then a law that stops people understanding what they're charged with and so on. These are all sort of introduced gradually one at a time, and there's very, very little mainstream criticism of them. The vast majority of people have absolutely no understanding that we have moved in a very authoritarian direction in the last 20 years. And it's much more significant than people realize. And we're seeing the tip of the iceberg with one or two quite well-known names. So the two most well-known names would be Julian Assange and Craig Murray being imprisoned in very, very unusual circumstances in both cases. But those are the ones that have sort of made it into the public consciousness. There's a whole much bigger group of people who were arrested in relation to supposed terrorism offences and so on, where, as you say, their court cases are becoming Kafkaesque. They don't really understand the details of what they're accused of. They don't understand the evidence against them. And it becomes impossible to have a fair trial in these circumstances. And this is just the early tip of the iceberg. Once you have introduced these laws and you've started prosecuting a handful of people for terrorism offences, then if you look at, say, the recent bills where the government is trying to allow undercover police or MI6 agents to commit crimes and so on, you start to realise that we have a long history of undercover officers infiltrating people who were not terrorist groups. They were just protest organizations and left-wing campaign organizations. And you don't know, what's going to happen next. And in fact, I think there's a sort of canary in the coal mine. If you look at what's just been talked about in Australia, they've tried to introduce laws which allow the government to hack into your online communications, delete some of it, but also to change some of it. And this seems absolutely bizarre. And it's going to become more and more difficult for ordinary people to have any real understanding of what is going on when government officials can do these things. So we have to hope that awareness of these things increases, and at some point there is a pushback from the wider population as they start to recognize that these are the early steps of authoritarianism. And we don't want to end up sort of like East Germany during the Cold War, where everybody was spying on their neighbors and, it just became an awful society to live in.
It's the ultimate irony, isn't it? Like we talked about last week, the constant hegemony that proposed in the West is to repel the totalitarian East. And yet it's to not only borrowing their clothes, we seem to be stealing their clothes from them.
Absolutely.
And trying to give the impression that we're somehow better. But it seems strange, doesn't it, to argue that a person is better than another person when the person who argues that they're better constantly wants to be like the person who they're putting down.
Yes.
It almost takes a certain kind of fool to fall for it.
So the strange thing is, there was a great article. There's a writer in Australia called Caitlin Johnston, and she once wrote an article saying we can't blame people for their brainwashing. Basically, she's saying we can't blame people for falling for propaganda because there's so much propaganda and it so completely pervades the mainstream media that until your eyes are opened to it, if that's all you've ever understood all of your life, then it never occurs to you to question it. And I've probably said this on a previous program, that until I was 35, it had never occurred to me that a great deal of what I was seeing in the mainstream media was a huge distortion of what's really going on. And so something has to trigger this awakening. And so however stupid I might like to think that people are for not really getting it, however frustrated we might feel that people don't understand these things, it is unfortunately human nature, and it is the majority of people who actually do believe a great deal of the propaganda they're told. And it's a minority who manage to kind of work out how to escape. And oddly enough, whilst on the whole I'm very critical of Hollywood, I do think that the Matrix film was actually intended to be an insight into present day, where most people lead a life that's not really what's going on. And it's only when somebody decides consciously they are going to try and understand what's going on that they kind of escape from all their brainwashing and their delusions and so on. And so I forever hope that more people will wake up. But as yet, perhaps things just have to get worse in in countries like Britain and America before they'll start getting better. Whereas in a lot of other countries, like developing countries, where they've been on the receiving end of really quite brutal governments supported by the United States and supported by Britain, a lot more of the population are aware of this type of thing, and there is much more pushback.
Yeah, and obviously, excuse me, when we move on to look at propaganda and the nature of propaganda in the future, we can get into the realms of sociology and philosophy and psychology and social psychology, etc., in terms of making sense of this, and certainly in terms of understanding the trigger. But I think there's multiple triggers, because multiple populations and demographics come from multiple places, therefore they have different triggers, is how I perceive it.
Absolutely, I agree, yeah.
And so that can be discussion for another day. Just moving on to another aspect of the discussion on terrorism. We talked about over the last 20 years the nature in which laws have become more authoritarian, more draconian. And I guess there's two ways of looking at it, not necessarily two ways that we would look at it, but two ways perhaps an outsider might look at it. On the one hand, you've got this terrorism, these terrorist acts that take place domestically, either in the US or in the UK, for example, or in Paris or Brussels. And the public at large, the public we've just been talking about, the large majority of people who are victims of this propagandizing, this social conditioning in a successful way from the state's perspective, they would expect the state to respond. So if the state is perceiving this sort of large clump of people that they believe they've successfully propagandized, they're also aware that those same people would expect the state to respond, probably in the way in which the state has responded. However, for those of us in the minority who've risen above the propagandizing and can see through the smokescreen, we might put a different slant on it. We might actually argue that, and as your evidence suggests, that the secret services and the governments, let's take it for example, the US and the UK, have turned a blind eye to people who they in turn educated and skilled up in becoming terrorists. And when these people actually became terrorists and domestically, there possibly, according to some, wasn't necessarily just a blind eye turned. There was also, in some people's expectations and some people's arguments, that the state in itself played at least a partial proactive role in the terrorism taking place within that state.
So that's it. Sorry,
can I just finish off the point? Yeah, therefore, the state response in a draconian way over the last 20 years, where it's become more authoritarian, from the minority's perspective, was really their raison d'etre. The intention was to create the fallow soil, if you like, or the conditions in which people would expect or demand this draconian authoritarian response, which is what they primarily wanted in the first place.
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. I think that, so just the other day, strangely enough, somebody asked me, what do I think actually happened on September the 11th, 2001? To what extent were governments involved, including the US government? And my answer to this is, we know the US government has lied about a lot of things in relation to 2001, as well as lots of other things, right? But to actually show convincingly that the US government played a part, I think is extremely difficult. And I'm not convinced the burden of proof has really been met. So it's speculative. And in fact, I remember at the time of the 2005 attacks in London on the Underground and on the buses and so on, number of people speculating that the British government or the intelligence services might even have played a role in that. And again, I think it's perfectly plausible. I think it's a few years since I researched it, but I remember thinking that the government's explanations of various things did not seem to add up. There were inconsistencies, but still there wasn't enough for me to conclude that the government had necessarily played a role. And so I tend to just kind of remains as an open question.
Exactly.
But I think that there is a long history of governments doing what are called false flag attacks. And there's a number of these documented in the history books. Perhaps we should do a show one day about it, because I don't have the notes on that to hand. But so it's perfectly plausible that governments will commit violent acts on their home soil to blame it on others to justify their own actions and new laws and so on. But to actually demonstrate it and document it and prove it is extremely difficult.
Absolutely, which leaves that vacuum that the state then responds by saying that's a conspiracy theory, so that they can knock it back.
Absolutely.
And I think sometimes as well that people become even more suspicious when the state moves in so quickly to throw these sound bites and slogans around to put down any justification for further examination, or they leave it for years and years and years, so most people aren't really interested anymore, and then they publish a report. It becomes again a bit of a show trial, but it's just yesterday's fish and chip paper. It doesn't really have anything dramatically to offer the state and the way we move forward.
Exactly, I agree with that analysis. There was something you mentioned earlier in the sort of first part of your slightly earlier question, when you were talking about how we deal with terrorists and so on. And I think that actually Jeremy Corbyn's approach on the whole was that, listen, you'll never deal with terrorism unless you sit and talk to them. You have to find out what their grievances are, why it is that they become terrorists, because these people are not insane. Whatever the media might like to tell us, most of these people are not just completely brainwashed idiots who believe that they can exterminate everybody in the West for various religious or ideological reasons. There's actually a logic to a lot of what goes on. And if we talk to these people, when researchers have tried to talk to these people, they found out that there are reasons why people do these things. And if you look at, say, American support for the Saudi government, that is one of the reasons given for terrorists to commit terrorist acts in the Middle East and so on. Yes. And that actually, if we tried not committing crimes ourselves and not supporting criminal governments and so on, I think it is highly likely that the vast majority of terrorism would disappear very, very quickly. And in fact, if you look at the economic side of things, that if actually we were actively working with developing countries to ensure that the masses of their populations have a decent life, and we had a sort of proactive, positive role in the world instead of a military role in the world, then I think it is highly likely that each government would be perfectly capable of dealing with terrorism with its own resources reasonably easily. The problem comes about that we support the wrong governments for the wrong reasons, and we do terrorism ourselves, and so on. So I often think of this terrorism thing, which has been this enormous threat for 20 years, according to the propaganda. If we actually were genuinely intent on dealing with it and dealing with economic issues, it would actually become a trivial issue in the end.
Which is fundamentally impossible, Rod, if we then look at the fact that our economic system is capitalist and driven by the creation of profit, and the most successful creator of profit on the planet is industrial war machine, the armaments industry. And the money to be made from shareholder dividends alone by some of these top right-wing politicians in terms of their investments, it's not within their interest. It's certainly not within the whole corporate interest of the war machine to do anything other than continue how they're doing it, and obviously use propaganda to create conflict and create war, so that these small number of investors see huge returns on those investments.
Well, I think that's a really good point. In fact, that's the evidence that's emerging from Afghanistan in terms of what's been going on for the last 20 years. That the vast majority of people with any power in Afghanistan seem to see the whole war as nothing more than an opportunity to make money and to extract wealth from governments and so on. And you had this perpetual war machine. And I think you're absolutely right that whilst that is there, and it has immense power and it has immense influence over foreign policy and so on, that this is likely to continue indefinitely into the future until enough people back home, that's in America and in Britain, and also in countries like France, because they do something similar, wake up and start saying, actually, we don't want governments that do this. And I think for the vast swathe of American people to wake up and stop their government doing foreign wars, it is a huge ask. The propaganda system at the moment is so effective. But one of the things that somebody reminded me of, and I may have mentioned this before, is that often systems seem really strong and really powerful right up to the moment they collapse, when everybody realizes just how fragile and unstable they are. And if you look at the way the financial system collapsed in 2008, people realize the financial system is like a house of cards. You know, you take one away and the whole thing just can come collapsing down. And so it's impossible to know how stable this whole kind of extremist war machine, profit-making edifice really is, and what might trigger some significant change to come about in the future. But we'll just have to sort of keep working on it ourselves, and hope that we can gradually try to get more people to wake up and bring about change.
I think, close to finishing off, I think anybody who has the opportunity to study Marxist and Hegelian dialectics would do themselves a massive favor, because the whole argument certainly within the Marxist dialectic is that we respond to the kettle whistling. We respond to the 2008 collapse in the markets. But actually, if they think about the system as being a building, the concrete cancer was growing for decades and decades and decades. We've just responded to the final catalyst that saw the building fall down, whereas we could have moved in a lot earlier and changed the future, changed the way in which the events occurred. So that's really important. I think that you have to be close enough and you have to have the information, the data, etc., in order to be able to see something potentially coming. Otherwise, most of these things just turn out to be a shock because we're not paying attention, and our corporate media isn't skilling us up to pay attention, and it isn't giving us the information to respond to.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. But strangely enough, I know lots of kind of experts writing that there is yet another imminent financial crisis at some point building up in the system, and yet you wonder whether we're going to do anything different afterwards to change the system. I hope it would wake people up, but we just have to hope.
Well, that links into my very last point, and I think this is the nature of lobbying, because the power of the lobbies suggest that, certainly, for example, the Conservative Party, they're more likely to respond to those billionaires and multimillionaires who are giving them money, and also determining to a significant extent the direction of policy making. So therefore, what you see with the current economic system is being, certainly in this country, it's being almost entirely buffered by the housing market, which means you have to keep the housing market high, because what that effectively means is if the housing market crashes, it's potentially going to take many other things with it, as I say, especially in this country, in the US. But my very last point, leading on from lobbyists, I think, is how powerful they are in terms of determining who becomes the leaders of particular political parties in relation to what you were talking about in terms of weapons of mass destruction, because I don't believe that FDR would have agreed to the atomic bombs being dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. But Harry Truman, of course, was prepared to. And that was a massive thing to take on board. You know, Truman took over from FDR in the April of 45 when FDR died. And suddenly the direction in relation to dropping those bombs was dramatic in terms of how it changed.
Well, it sounds like you've researched that period of history rather more than I have done. So I don't know about what FDR would or would not have done. I think it's always fascinating to kind of discuss these counterfactual.
Conjecture, yes.
That's right, but of course it's always slightly hypothetical, and there's no sort of definitive answer.
No, there's no definitive answer, and you're absolutely right. But if you look at the historical makeup of people and the decisions that they made and the things that they said, we can sort of put the jigsaw together and get maybe not an incomplete picture, but some sort of picture that is fairly accurate.
How different history might have been.
Yes, of course, absolutely. Yeah, again, Rod Driver, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the show. And obviously next week we're going to continue in another topic, but we've covered the exaggerations, if you like, the tools for manipulating large populations through fear and control over the last couple of weeks. So please, viewers, go back to last week's and obviously previous episodes in which we talked to Rod and enlighten yourself. Thank you so much, Rod. See you next week.
Been a pleasure. Thanks very much. Look forward to next week.